Jack Schenker, you've been following this story. Tell me what's happening to the poor old Nile Delta.
Hi, Karen. Well, the Nile Delta is a fascinating region. I don't know how much people know about the region, but it's actually home to a huge proportion of Egypt's population and responsible for about 60% of its food supply. So Egypt really relies on this area for its survival. And what's happening is it's facing a combination of short-term environmental threats and a long-term threat as well. And the long-term threat is rising sea levels as a result of climate change, the melting of the Arctic ice caps and so on. And a lot of the Delta region is actually very low-lying, just up to a metre above sea level, and some areas are actually below sea level. So there's a lot of debate over exactly how much sea levels might rise over the next century, but even the most optimistic predictions of sea level rise would result in a massive amount of population displacement, the loss of a lot of jobs, a lot of industry, and basically the destruction of Egypt's breadbasket. And so the country's already facing a huge population crisis in terms of overpopulation and pressure on resources. So things aren't looking too good at the moment.
No, they're not. And you travelled around the area extensively, Jack. You spoke with people who make a living from, we'll say, farming around the Delta region. Their livelihoods are in peril now. Is there anything that can be done to stop this?
Well, there are a number of things, and the Egyptian government, in some respects, has been quite proactive. One of the major threats is coastal erosion, where the land is being steadily chipped away at, and, it's actually literally falling into the sea. And the Egyptian government has been working with Chinese contractors to build a huge seawall in certain areas, big kind of concrete blocks, which break up the effect of the waves and limit the amount of erosion that takes place on the coast. There's also an effort, and Professor Suleiman will probably be able to tell you more about this, to kind of educate Egyptians about the dangers of climate change and the need to adapt to sort of the coming realities in that respect. But I think there's also a lot of denial and a lot of quite a sort of fatal combination of cynicism and ignorance amongst not just Egyptian farmers themselves. The farmers themselves tend to be quite aware of what the kind of dangers they're facing, but actually amongst the higher levels in the scientific bodies and in the government itself, which is racked by a lot of corruption and a real disconnect between the state and the people. There's definitely the potential for some solutions, but at the moment things are looking quite grim.
There isn't the political will to actually apply some of them, and it's extraordinary, Jack. This Nile Delta, it's home to something like 2/3 of the country's rapidly, mind you, growing population, and it's responsible for more than 60% of its food supply.
That's right, yes. Tourists come to Egypt every year, and they go and see the pyramids in Cairo, and they go down to Luxor and see all the wonders of the ancient world. But the real Egypt sort of lies just north of Cairo, between the capital and the Mediterranean shoreline. And it's a region with a really fascinating history, kind of imperial.
Alexandria and all of that, yes.
Exactly. One of the greatest cities of the ancient world, and imperial invaders have come and gone, from the British to the Germans to the French and the Romans and so on. And it's kind of, littered with the remains of these invaders that have come and gone. And what's really interesting is if you speak to the farmers on the ground there who are facing the reality of climate change, they often couch the problem they're facing in the terms of occupation. They say the sea is coming to conquer our lands, and we have to defeat the sea, in the same way that we defeated all the previous colonizing armies that came to try and subjugate us. So I think people are very, very aware of the difficulties they face, but obviously Egypt's a country which faces a lot of poverty, a lot of economic problems, and as I say, the population increase. I mean, already you've got around 80 million people in Egypt, and there are estimates that over the next 20 years that'll go up to more like 110 million. So there's already a massive pressure on resources,
yes.
And that's only going to get worse.
OK, Jack, if you can stay on the line, I want to go to John Gibbons as well. John is a columnist on environmental issues with the Irish Times. He's also founder of climatechange.ie. I had no idea, John, it was as bad as this for the Delta region until I started reading it. It seems to be a fait accompli that you're saying over the next 20 years you think the Nile Delta may no longer exist.
I think large portions of it will be gradually abandoned. I think Jack described very well efforts to use technology to shore up the sea. That that's Canute-like. That is all
Yes.
that'll do is buy you a couple of years, and eventually it'll become so expensive those regions will be abandoned. So this is unfortunate, and this is certainly driven by climate change, in particular by rising sea levels.
Rising sea levels,
But I
yeah.
think to my mind, there's a bigger story here. I think of the parable of the golden goose. Egypt was blessed and has been blessed since antiquity with an amazing resource, the Nile Delta. Now, the Nile Delta brought annual floods. Those floods produced some of the most fertile soil on earth, and this created the wealth of ancient Egypt. Now, in more recent times, as populations increased, the flood, instead of being seen as an annual boon, began to be seen as a threat. So they
Yes.
decided to stop the flood and harness the water. And Nasser, the great Egyptian nationalist, opened the Aswan Dam in 1971. He basically tamed the Nile, which was, of course, great news, produced hydroelectricity, etc. But the price for that has been the loss of fertility in the entire region, and also salinization is now destroying the land. And this is
Because
entirely
these
separate.
floods would have brought fresh water into these areas,
Correct.
cleaned up the land, taken the salt out of the lands that
And
may have been
kept
there.
the salt down. Now what we're seeing is, and of course, Jack also talked about really the issue we can't get away from here, and that is the population explosion. At the moment, 83 million people living in Egypt, probably rising to 110 million people over the next 20 or 30 years. The fact remains that primarily agricultural countries like this cannot carry these populations. Egypt is, and you mentioned earlier about being surprised by this. I suppose I study this pretty much every day of the week. I'm not at all surprised by it. If we had the time, I could list you 10 or 15 more disaster areas, every bit as bad as
Around the
this.
world, you're
Around
saying?
the world. In fact, I could even take
Highly
them in the
yeah.
Mediterranean region, the amount of climate-related disasters. But it's not just climate, because you'll have people listen to this show say, Karen,
Global warming,
he's
yes,
kidding
I
you,
know,
it's all a
yes.
hoax, don't be listening to those square fellas. However, the fact remains that the pressure of humans consuming resources, excreting, if I may use that phrase, pollution, these are the pressures that are effectively wiping out regions like the Nile. And those of you who remember the parable of the golden goose, we had this marvellous resource, and we just thought, I wonder how much more we can get out of this resource.
Yeah.
So we cut its head off. Unfortunately, the replumbing of the Nile has destroyed it. Now, that destruction has taken a number of years to play out, and it has been accelerated by climate-related sea level rises. But the fact is, that destruction, you do not have to believe in climate change to see the destruction of the Nile Delta. That will take place purely and simply by the intense pressure of human populations and pollution and extraction along that region.
But I mean, you would think that with all of the focus on climate change globally right now, and we know there are sceptics out there, but generally the acceptance is that climate change is having a fairly devastating effect on many areas, you would have thought that there would have been much more of an effort to encourage, shall we say, if the Egyptians weren't interested in it themselves, to encourage the Egyptians to really try and see what can be done, how can we stop this destruction. I mean, could they, it's a very good phrase you used, replumbing the Nile, could they replumb the replumbing?
I honestly don't think so. I'll tell you why. The floodplain is now built on. People live there. Tens of millions of people live in the floodplain. So, unfortunately, we can't roll back history. In fact, if you take this closer to home, Ireland has floodplains that are built on all over the country
right, yes,
that we have
that's
allowed.
right.
So, when we get the once in 100-year floods every 5 years because of climate change in Ireland, you're going to have more and more communities like we've seen in Clonmel, like we've seen elsewhere, with their homes destroyed. And people will say, oh, it's a natural disaster. Why did this happen? It happened a combination. Yes, there's climate change, but there's also lousy political planning that is allowing untrammeled building in areas that nature needs in order to control rainwater. Rainwater isn't a problem. The problem is rainwater has nowhere to go if we build on the floodplain.